I guess I should introduce myself for the camera. I'm going to look right at you guys and say that I'm George Lewis, composer, musicologist, professor of music at Columbia University, and composer of these two works we're going to be talking about, Soundlines, a dreaming track, and P multitudinous.
Thanks, George. And I'm Leila Adu-Gilmore. I'm a professor of music technology here at NYU Steinhardt and music and performing arts professions. And I'm also a composer, a theorist, and performer. So, George, first I wanted to ask you about multitudinous, and I just thought for people who have just seen the piece or are thinking about seeing it, it's interesting to me that there's these 7 groups. So there's 3 stationary groups. One is a woodwind quintet, one is a string quartet, and one is contact trio, which has a sampler, 2 channel electronics, and piano and small percussion. And then we can go into the mobile trio and the multitude in a second, but I just thought, what's the reasoning for you behind having these traditional quartets, the wind quintet and a string quartet first? So just thinking about
First, in terms of what?
I guess including them in the group, because you've got a huge amount of instruments, and the multitude, which is one of these groups, is open players and open instrumentation. So I wondered about the thought of having this string quartet, which is what we think of as a very typical Western canon quartet. You could have had any kind of quartet. So I just wondered about using painting with these colours of different groups, and some of them being more or less traditional, the Western canon, and moving between them.
Yeah, well, the Western canon is coming in for a lot of deformation. It's that Houston Baker thing about deformation of mastery. And so I didn't even think about the possibility that people would hear this in a canonistic way, because of the fact that there's so much going on. So if you're looking at it on paper and you see there's a woodwind quintet, but they're not doing many woodwind quintet-like things, at least the kinds of things that people are traditionally noted for doing. And the same with the string quartet and the contact. You named the group, so maybe I'll go through them a little bit. There's the Contacta trio, which is actually a tribute to Stockhouse, but also a tribute to Ben Patterson, who disliked Contacta, and that was the beginning of the impetus. The dislike of Contacta was the impetus for his famous paper piece. So there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of personal resonance for me because at the end of his life I got to know him a little bit. The other, the mobile trio, there's a mix of trios, of ensembles that are sort of could be considered canonical, and other groups that really aren't. I mean, you have these ad hoc formulations. The other thing about them is that those groups are just containers. So in other words, the woodwind group can decide that only one person is going to be a part of that. So they can reformulate themselves. And that's why I hadn't thought about it as being canonical, because they can always reformulate themselves. They can decide that just one person goes. They can communicate with other people. And that's because of the larger situation of P multitudinous, which is that it is situational. That is, you start with a large group of people, maybe there's 16 people in the basic groups. The multitude can be any size, it can be 100 people, it doesn't matter. And everybody is self-organizing. There's no individual person that can step out and make a decision. They have to talk to other people. They have to construct consensus. They have to do what Spinoza is talking about in terms of realizing the power of the multitude through self-organization. Now, self-organization is something I'm very interested in improvised music groups, because it relates very directly to self-organization in other spheres, autopoietic behavior, social behavior, the ways in which people come together and they don't know what they're going to do, but then they start doing things. And so that's a way of using that already present capability in human beings in the musical domain. And so the mobile conductors, see, there is something in what you say in a way, because when I send this out to people and they say, well, there's a conductor, but we're not going to have conductors. And I say, well, anybody can be a conductor in this piece. And the conductors don't stand in front of the group and do things. They're mobile, so they might conduct the woodwind group for a while, or they might go over and conduct another group for a while. And a lot of the time they're just sitting around doing nothing because they're supposed to be listening to the environment and really being sensitive to the current situation. So that when people decide to do something, whether they decide to play a notated part, which is a part of the piece, or whether they decide to do something from the grid of possibilities, whatever they're doing, they do it collectively, and then they do it at the right time. And what's defined as the right time is when they come in relative to the current situation. In other words, when we started doing the piece in Banff, which was the premiere, we were preparing the premiere. We had to work out a lot of the ethics of the piece, because it does have a sort of a situational ethics. And one of the ethics that people were a little confused about was, they said, well, how do we make contrast? And I said, you don't need to make contrast. There's going to be contrast already. But to come in and actually create contrast, like something is happening very softly, and then you start yelling or something, you know, that's out of the bounds of the situation, because in other words, you can go somewhere from the situation. In other words, the trajectories, which is a very important part of it, will take you anywhere. So there's situation, trajectory, and you had another question, but I'll just tell you this last bit. The third part is the notion of entropy, which relates to situation. In a lot of improvised music, what happens is that it's freely improvised music, where you don't have a necessary form, where people are creating forms in real time. There will be a moment of interregnum in which people don't quite know what they want to do, and they're negotiating to create a consensus for where they're going to go. And that's all perfectly audible. The thing is, audiences can hear it too, but their audiences are usually trained to regard music as something that is done to them by the musicians. And so they sit back or it's in contemporary music, it's judged often on the basis of how odd the music sounds, or what special technique they're using, or whatever. And what you'd like them to listen for is the ethics of the situation, which are audible, and the intentions of the musicians, which are audible to the audience, because they're audible to the musicians. So that's how they figure out what they're going to do, because they're listening to each other, and the sound is a carrier for meaning, which is a very important takeaway from all this. And so that's as available to audiences who know this. Once you realize it, you can do it. And it's as available to the audience as it is to the musicians, because the thing is, the musicians and the audience are hearing the piece pretty much at the same time. So they're both accessible to that level of temporality. Okay, now the third element is entropy. Okay, I'll get to that. At a certain point, they reach consensus. Okay, they're playing. Somebody gets bored, or somebody thinks it's time for a change, or anything happens, then the interregnum business starts. Okay, now then that's where the entropy bit comes in. Your job as a person playing P multitudinous is to anticipate when that's going to happen. In other words, once it starts, that's your moment to introduce new material. If you introduce it before that point, when there's the consensus, it's like you're interrupting what a conversation is going on.
Exactly.
If you do it situationally, it won't sound bad, but it'd be much better if you did it at a time when there's a lot of change going on anyway, because change, moments of interregnum is the place in politics or wherever where we can introduce real change, when people don't know which way things are going to go, or when they're not sure, or when there's a certain, that's when you do it. That's when you decide to do it.
Yeah, I was interested here because you have these notes, for instance, take all the time you need to think and plan individually and or collectively. So this isn't the performer notes, and I think I'm familiar with playing free improvised music, and I'm also familiar with being a composer, and I'm familiar with being conducted. And in the space of being a free improvising musician, or an improvising musician with rules, we have these sort of, I guess there's a training that we have from musician to musician. So part of what I think of teaching music in any sphere is like teaching people to not be a jerk.
Oh, I see.
Like, how do you listen to another person? How do you wait and hear what they are going to play? And I like the way that you're relating this to language and a conversation, because this is a similar way of being a good human and good citizen, which the Spinoza quote is also about, which is how do we have piety? How do we be a human with piety? How do we listen to the person next to us? But I'm interested in your score that you're telling people how to do this, because they could come from any tradition to this score. Perhaps they haven't improvised before. Maybe some musicians this may be the first time they improvised, and so you're directly telling them, come in at a similar dynamic, wait and hear. You're sort of giving a crash course in how to be a good improviser.
Well, not really.
Part of it,
I'm giving them instructions for how to play the piece.
Yeah.
They might, in terms of improvisation in certain spheres, it's okay to come in screaming.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's not okay in this piece. Mm-hmm. So that means that it's a subset of the total set of possibilities that an improvising musician come up with. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the improvisation, everything is decided collectively. Most of the improvisations that I see, people are atomized. They make decisions on their own. Mm-hmm. Nobody makes a decision on their own in P multitudinous. Everybody has to talk to everybody else. And so they also make decisions across the ensembles. So they can easily decide, the woodwind people can play with the multitude. Mm-hmm. Okay, or the multitude can decide, out of all the 50 people in the multitude, we're picking you to go out there and do it. Mm-hmm. All those things are possible. But it has to be done collectively. No one can just step out and say, okay, this is my turn now. No. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing so I'm actually providing a methodology which relates in some ways to methodologies I use or have used or did use when I was doing free improvisation more, which is the idea of looking at situations, trying to think about entropy, not introducing things if other things are already going on. We don't need to add or pile on. We can just, because it affects the sound. It's the ethics, but it's also the structure. Mm-hmm. And so the structure becomes unwieldy. People have a hard time hearing it. If they don't do what it says here, it doesn't go as well for them because they can't hear enough of what's going on, and you can't create collective direction, which is what they have to do. Because the thing is, since there is no central conductor, they have to self-organize, and the hardest thing for them to do as a group of 50 people is to end. They don't know how to do it. How do you do it? But somehow, after doing the instructions for a while and thinking about these principles, the performers in the first two performances, the premiere and actually in repeated rehearsals and performances, were able to, I'd say, well, look, do it for 30 minutes. And they would do it for 29 minutes, 31 minutes. It was incredible. No watches, none of that, But they did it. It was like they had this larger sense of time that they didn't really know they had, and that they were able to collectively express time, collectively experience time, and through the process of dialogue to really create their own temporality. And so that becomes, and so the instructions are kind of designed to bring those capabilities out, which are already latent in the improvising experience, but somehow that's how we can get people in touch with these things they already know.
And are you thinking about this in terms of, I guess the Spinoza quote is making me think about politics. Are you thinking about...
You should read the quote. So they
know
what it is.
Let me read this quote. Where is it? Here. The right of a commonwealth is determined by the power of a people that is guided as though by a single mind. But this union of minds could in no way be conceived unless the chief aim of the commonwealth is identical with that which sound reason teaches us is for the good of all men. And then you also talk about this in relation to Yves Sitton's work, which relates to improvising and this.
And the piece is dedicated to Yves because he wrote this incredible article for our Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisation Studies on the Spinoza, improvised music, the power of the multitude, And the idea that for Spinoza, body and mind are the same thing. And so no one really knows what a body can do. And so that's a very inspiring concept when you think about any kind of musical situation or social situation where when you come into P multitudinous, you really don't know what's possible. I mean, and what ends up being made represents what you thought was possible at the time, you know, or it should. It shouldn't represent what I thought was possible at the time. Then, because that's why I ask people, don't listen to prior performances. Don't go on the web and say, aha, now this is the right way to do it, and start imitating that. Use the tools of the use the tools of the score to create what you believe in. And then that ends up being connected somehow with this, I don't know if it connects with sound reason, but certainly the idea that idea of the power of the multitude is somehow embedded in what happens in the course of performance.
So yeah, that's really, I really like this. I read through the Sit-On article just quickly, and just reading about this idea of the sensible or sensible, and thinking of being passive and active. And I like this thought, also reading through another text, I think Adu, but just thinking about being, I'm thinking, and the question that's really burning on my mind is just being a present human, being actuated, being actualized, being really in the room. And I think that can be difficult in an academic setting, it can be difficult in a business setting, it can be difficult in a musical setting, but I feel like this piece can show us how to do that in a musical setting in a way. And hopefully the audience can feel this interaction or see this interaction, because you're involving non-verbal, you know, there's the written score, but there's also people can give each other hand signals, and some people are moving, percussionist is moving, there's a mobile trio that's moving, so you're involving bodies in a way that we are not so used to in a sphere where people are holding a classical instrument. They're usually stuck there, and so we get to experience a piece where suddenly people are moving around. And I think that the Western canon, again, to mention that, is sort of the outlier when it comes to having audience participation or dance and all those things kind of, squirreled away. Because most cultures have dance as part of music, or the audience participating. And so you're kind of involving this as well, this moving through. I think it can show us in a way, the way that, you know, it's kind of, I don't know, it makes me think a bit of a utopian society, but maybe I'm going too far. But
well, you know, it's not far wrong. I mean, you do have this idea that people are trying to get what they want, and if they do get what they want through the performance of this music and through the engagement with the materials, that's not a bad thing. Whether it's utopian, I don't know, but it's certainly communitarian.
I like that, communitarian. I think we can learn something from that in many spheres right now, especially in this country, but on this planet right now, thinking about the world. And Spinoza was also thinking about plants and humans and everyone being together. It's not that it's not such a Darwinian getting to the top and we own everything.
Well, it kind of anticipates actor network theory, which is also kind of French in a way. So, you know. So
there's one thing I did want to ask you from reading parts of The Power Stronger Than Itself, your book, about the history of the AACM. So one thing I think that I feel a bit naughty asking, because as composers don't usually ask about these things, but there is this spiritual aspect that comes through in the training and thinking. So we have in music, we have harmony training, musicianship training, we're studying, and in this book you're talking about experimentalism, all these different I guess rigor and training that we're talking that's there. But there's often a line in a meeting or something about spirituality or numerology or something, and I think that's interesting. And I liked thinking through Adu, or how do you say it?
Adu.
I like thinking through Adu because it's being described more as being an authentic person, being in an authentic state, having inner peace. Because I think spirituality kind of freaks people out as a word, because it can be opposing people. So I think being more actualized, having some peace, and I guess respecting other citizens, these things might be more legible. And
well, let me everything. I'm going to preface this by saying everything I know or think I know about Pierre Adu comes from my friend Arnold Davidson, who worked with him, and also worked with Foucault. And so, the book that one could look at, Arnold has a series of dialogues with Adu called "The Present Alone Is Our Happiness." That's one of them. And then there's the other book called "Philosophy as a Way of Life," from which Arnold developed the idea of improvisation as a way of life. So what they're thinking about the Stoics in particular as being sort of a paradigmatic group. That's the idea of not knowing yourself but caring for yourself. What does it mean to live well? And so in order to live well, one follows certain protocols. One of the protocols is ascesis. Okay, so there's a looking back and trying to produce a kind of a detached but involved sense of where you are in the universe. Another one is attention, awareness. And as I'm reading all these aspects of what he was calling spiritual exercises, it began to relate very clearly to what people could be doing in improvisation. And in Arnold's case, the article he wrote for our volume talked about moral perfectionism in the work of Sonny Rollins. So it does relate, and reading that through Adu. And so in a way, the Adu thesis or set of ideas about spiritual exercise is more related to Soundlines, as I sent you in that long-winded text, which I originally wrote for ICE, and so that we could all be on the same page of what we were trying to achieve. But it certainly does relate to improvisation, as Arnold saw very clearly.
So let's talk about Soundlines a little now. So we have Steve Schick, who is walking from the US-Mexico border to the San Francisco Bay border. And you...
Well, not the border, but just
San Francisco Bay. And you recreate you recreate this with text, music, and field recordings in a surround sound space.
Yeah.
So, and I guess not everyone knows what a surround sound space, or I guess they do know. What do you mean specifically when you say surround sound space?
A lot of people have these things in their homes now, these 5.1 sound systems where the sound moves around your head and there's a big subwoofer that's playing big bass and all that kind of thing. So it's basically thinking once again about trajectories in the same way. It's a way of doing with electronics that P multitudinous is doing with bodies. And I think there'll also be, we're planning some sort of situation for the performance. Jim Finley, the director and designer, and Nick Hofek, the lighting designer, we're trying to work out ways in which the electronics, which are articulating this sort of 8-channel sound system where I can send sound here or over there or around or these different trajectories, zigzagging all around and all that. And there's 8 instruments, so I can send them all in those directions. So it can be like a lot of people sort of running around the space or walking very slowly around the space, or involved in a sort of a ritual procession around the space, or all those kinds of things are possible. So all of those things come down to how, the idea of the trajectories, and what Nick and Jim were thinking about was the idea of having the computer program which is running these things actually communicate with the lighting designs or maybe give cues of different kinds. But that's sort of a detail, but maybe we should give people a sense of the overview of what Soundlines is about.
Yeah.
How would you feel about that?
Okay, so it's a spoken narrative. So it's narrating the terrain. And this is inspired by the Australian Aboriginal songline or dreaming track, which navigates landscape, and gains access to ancient stories. So we hear Schick's narrative, it can be anything from descriptions of the real landscape to signs that he reads, to things he says to other people, to things they say to him, and things he says to himself and questions himself as well. So all these things are in there. And I guess I was thinking about this, you say somewhere in your notes that you're thinking about him as different characters of the same there's different facets of him, and in your opera afterward you use characters who sometimes are different facets of the same person.
Yeah, this is a funny thing, because in Afterward, which is about the AACM, and it's very odd because I don't think there are many operas that I know about experimental music or composers of the 20th century. I was thinking I should probably make a John Cage opera or something like that.
Yeah.
There'd be different themes in there, but in this case, I took a lot of the libretto, I made it myself, and not being a creative writer.
Mm-hmm.
I rewrote a lot of the material that I found in interviews and things that I wrote in the text. They became the libretto, and so in a sense it didn't matter who was speaking. It seemed absurd to have like Muhal, Richard Abrams, one of the ACM co-founders,
Mm-hmm.
as a character. Although there is a scene in which Muhal and Phil Coran meet in a cemetery, but they're not named as Muhal and Phil Coran.
Mm.
They're just two people meeting in a cemetery to think in a spooky environment to sort of bring this baby to fruition, the AACM. So the Czech translator for we did the piece in Ostrava Days in the Czech Republic, Peter Kotick's wonderful biennial series, and they had to translate the text into Czech for the subtitles, supertitles.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that it reminded him, because he actually was trained in African American literary theory, this guy, he's a Czech guy, and so he was saying that it reminded him of this notion of the community voice, which comes out in a lot of the scholarship on Toni Morrison's novels. It wasn't something that Morrison made herself, it was something that's been but it seems to be a regularly recurring notion of what happens there. So it's not like people are stereotypes, but when someone speaks, they're not just speaking as an individual character,
Mm-hmm.
they're speaking as one of the potential voices of the community.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, all of the characters in the whole opera, everyone who speaks, could be all part of a single voice, or a single inside someone's head, multiple personalities, debates going on inside their heads. So that's sort of against the sort of agonistic side of what opera is about, and so the idea they have to be these characters and they have to experience some quest. That's actually what P. Multitudinous is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Soundlines is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Soundlines has created a kind of a quest and a narrative and this linearity. But the major thing that Stephen Schick is doing, for me, it's a spiritual exercise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of ascesis. He has to go through a sort of ascesis, sleeping rough for 6 weeks or however long the trek was, walking many miles, taking wrong turns, experiencing various kinds of privation, having amazing conversation with people, but also wondering if he could really do it.
Mm.
And the real purpose of it was very simple. He wanted to prove that he was worthy of the love of who would become the woman who became his future wife. Now, that, of course, is something that anybody could do. And we talked, for example, about the possibility of it being overly male.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that it occurred to me is that I think the love interest can be anybody, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not, Stephen Schick is playing in his own piece, but at some point, someone else will want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that person could be, transgender, it could be anybody. So, and the story wouldn't have to be altered very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hardly at all, really. Maybe, in some cases, not one word would need to be altered.
Yeah, so I was interested in the fact that you said that you removed or added parts to the original text to create what you say is an interstitial space between prose and poetry.
Yeah.
So I wondered about, you've been talking about
That's just my way of saying I'm not a good poet.
But no, I was wondering about this space between having composed for sung voice, as in P. Multitudinous and Afterward, and then composing around spoken word, and how does that change things for you? Is there anything interesting in that space of having the spoken word versus the sung word? And I guess opera can be moving between the two.
Yeah, I guess in the operas I make, or the single opera I did make, or in other pieces, this might be the first piece I've done. No, it's not the first piece, but it's the first one in a while where I actually have had people speaking. Changing with the Times from '92 was a spoken piece. It was based on a sort of a modern day slave narrative, actually my dad. They asked him as a part of an adult education project to create autobiographies. And they said, well, here's an example. And they gave him the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. They said, make one like this. Very smart teacher. So he made his own, and I looked at it and I said, I can make a piece out of this. But so that kind of spoken word, it was mainly a series of vignettes, and and there was an actor that was playing my dad. In fact, he played it so well that some of my dad's friends said, "Is that you, George? There, you doing that?" Oh no, that's an actor playing me. I was very excited about that. But for Soundlines, I don't think singing was really an option. First of all, I wanted to write the piece for Stephen Schick, and over his many talents, he hasn't advertised himself as a singer. So I was going to have to work with the spoken word, which is okay with me. Also, I wanted it to be a bit like Changing with the Times, which I heard as a kind of a Hirschspiel, or like mystery theater. My sister is really a big fan of like mystery theater, all the old time radio, she loves this stuff. So in a way, I wanted it to be just like that. People would be sitting there late at night, they're listening to these weird sounds, and they're hearing Steve talk, and it's all very soothing and wonderful.
Yeah, there's a closeness to the spoken voice that we can kind of, I'm a singer as well, so I love singing, but I often listen to talking radio.
Too and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I'm a singer. Yeah. But I like listening to the talking radio at home just as much as I would listen to music, because the talking radio gives me a sense of home, actually. So I'll listen to New Zealand talking radio where I grew up, and then I feel like I'm at home in a way that more than reading a New Zealand newspaper would do. So I was interested in this choice of the voice.
Soundlines at first was not connected with the Aboriginal, but then I started thinking about it because it was the most obvious way of connecting this kind of trek. There were similar ideas, it seemed to me, about ascesis. I read, Bob Tompkinson's book, based on the fact that he was Douglas Stewart's, brother-in-law, my old friend and associate, and he and his wife Myrna, Douglas's sister, both live in Perth, and they've been working on these Aboriginals for years. And he was very sensitive to talking about the song lines and what they mean, and it occurred to me that this was like the Great Migration in some sense, but it's more. There's a ritual aspect to it. There's also an aspect of discovery, an aspect of ascesis. I also read the Bruce Chatwin book, which was very wonderfully romantic and beautiful, but I got more in a way out of the Tompkinson because it gave me a sense of looking at other Aboriginal traditions and imagining them. For example, I have no idea. There's a lot of discussion of Native American traditions, and of course there's all kinds of Native American groups that are all up and down the California coast where Steve was doing his thing. So as he's walking, just as in the song lines, we should be able to hear what's going on at a certain point in the land. I imagine that we would hear this in native cultures as well. And as you walk through a certain region, which is originally inhabited by these people, maybe you should, if you're very well attuned, be able to hear those resonances. And but at the same time, I didn't have any sense of trying to depict that. In other words, there's no kind of little, here's the didgeridoo section, or no. I write all the music, and I do it according to what I think it should sound like. But I wasn't trying to, at any point, that never happens, to sort of make kind of fake native stuff. Right?
Yeah.
I'm just writing my music, and that's it. Well, Steve is trying to. The narrator is thinking about what it must have been like at that time, and trying to actually pay homage to these people who came before, and listening for those resonances, and seeing how those resonances were, in a way, informed his track.
That makes sense. We should say about Steve Schick, who was a percussionist and conductor and teaches at UCSD, and was teaching here in Manhattan at the Manhattan School of Music before that, and played in Bangin' a Can All-Stars. So, and
was my colleague for 15 years at UC San Diego.
Ah, okay. So yeah,
I wrote an earlier piece for him called North Star Boogaloo. It's percussion and now fixed media. And that's one of those pieces. Steve is one of the world's great percussionists, and people follow him around like little puppies. And so this piece is always performed by these people who are following Steve around and who want to, be like Steve, I guess. They play this piece, they get some of the horror out, but it's like they've done these incredible performances by all these people. Generations at this point, it was like 96. So anyway, that's my association with him. And then he reimagined and reconstructed in himself as a conductor. And now he's this incredible conductor. He wasn't really conducting when I first met him, but then he reformed and recreated himself. And that's something we're both trying to do. I mean, around the time he started recreating himself as a conductor, I started paying more attention to composition after I wrote some pieces like Steve's piece, and I stopped for a while. Then about 2007, I went back. And so now it's been like 12 years, and I've been able to write a lot of pieces, and I'm trying to go as fast as I can, because who knows how long I can stick it out. And so 67 years old now, got to get stuff done. So yeah, I mean, there's this sense also in Soundlines of being sensitive to Steve's personal journey of transformation, which is a part of, again, what Adu is talking about. And there's this wonderful quote in, I think it's Philosophy is a Way of Life, where he says in philosophy, it's not about just creating a mirror work of art, he says. The purpose is to transform ourselves. So that's what I would like to have people do.
That's amazing. I'm thinking now that you say that about being a musician, improviser, and then as a composer, and with Steve being a percussionist and conductor, and there are a lot of parallels between being a percussionist and a conductor, and that's who we're thinking about, the tempo and the different fields of music that we play. But I was thinking now in these fields of composition, I'm teaching in music technology, you're a computer music composer, there's the field of improvisation, audio research. There's these kind of splitting into disciplines and titles and humans, but I guess thinking back to the time of Boulez and Verio at UQAM, where you also were, and where I saw you speak in Paris just this year, so you're still...
Oh yeah, that's right, you were there for that.
Yeah,
cool.
So the UQAM is the Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique, so they in Paris. So it seems that earlier on the composers kind of affected all these spheres more, and I sense that the composer is taking, I don't know, I sense that the composer in some senses is on the side of a lot of fields. That's just my sense of being composer.
On the side field. Meaning what?
I don't know, like... You
don't feel as engaged as you want to be? Or?
Yeah, I guess that maybe there's the composer theorist, but now, often I will be, I'm not a theorist, but I am. So I say I'm a composer theorist, and in fact I studied 10 years as a composer theorist. All my degrees say composer theorist. But now there's composition, and there's theory, and there's sort of different, conferences for one thing, and I guess this kind of sense of being a whole musician, and a Renaissance person as a musician, that's the reality, I think. Many people can cross all the spheres and feel comfortable in them, but I sense that there's always this, I sense a pressure personally to be in different boxes and wear different hats, but in fact
maybe you have to just hang out with some different people. No, it's true. I mean, I was the late Terry Adkins, who I wrote a piece for after his passing, in homage to him, called A Recital for Terry Adkins, because he would do these fantastic recitals, which would be like live performances, as he called it, animate the sculpture. And there's a dialogue that they published in Art Forum a couple of years ago, and we were talking about things, And one of the things we talked about was that, and this also comes up with Ben Patterson, where at a certain point, Ben Patterson, I think it's Robert Filiou, are both saying, well, Ben, neither one of us are doing the thing we were trained for. And so I was sort of envious of the visual art world in a way, because you could start out as a painter, then you could be a printmaker, you could make films, you could make performances, you could do whatever you wanted. And so it seemed to me that a lot of so-called composers actually started doing that too, and I would say I encountered that more in my interactions with the so-called New York downtown of the 70s and 80s, where people did move beyond this sort of tightly bound coupling of genre and practice.
I guess what
And
I'm
so
really
they could
saying.
say, composer, what is that? You decide what it is.
I guess
for
what I'm really
yourself.
saying is I'm aware that that was happening and it does happen.
Yeah.
I'm just noticing that this bifurcation is happening over time. I would expect things to become more fluid when in fact over the years, when it seems like now the definitions are less fluid. That I guess since the 80s or 70s.
Well, that's definition less fluid. That's good. And what's nice about it is you can redefine what it means to be a composer. It occurred to me when I first started doing this that I found it odd that, for example, let's say my former bandmaster and friend Anthony Braxton, who was writing pieces, he's written maybe 6 of his 12 opera cycle he's working on. And he was doing pieces for 4 orchestras. He had conceptual works for 3 galaxies, or any of that kind of thing, that he was supposed to be jazz. And he had all these, notated scores and everything. And a piece called The Wolfman by Bob Ashley, where you get out and you just start screaming into a microphone. That was considered classical music. I didn't see the point of that. But they both seem to be part of a larger sense of what you could do as a composer. So you put all those things together and you drop the business of genre. What you're left with is a mobility of practice. And I think that's what we are looking for.
Yeah.
And so in order to have that mobility of practice, you have to be around other people who can deal with that mobility. Now, another thing you can imagine is that there are media. In other words, if you're going to be a sculptor, printmaker, painter, whatever, those are kind of media in their own way. There's a medium for this, medium for that. So at a certain point, I decided that a lot of what I did was going to be, in other words, the Soundlines music there's no improvising in it. So it's all written from start to finish. So, and that's a medium I feel I have something to contribute to. And I don't feel as necessarily experimental or transgressive to introduce improvisation in that, any more than I feel that it's somehow experimental or transgressive to do the opposite and somehow start with the improvisation and then somehow introduce a notated element. The idea is that you work with the medium and you figure out what you're going to do for that piece or that environment. But I also started to think that I wanted to work with all these amazing performers who were spending all this time, like Claire Chase or whoever, doing it, and Seth Parker Woods, doing these incredible, these pieces, which are, they're incredibly well trained and they're audacious, they're experimental, they're trying new things. Why would I not want to work in that medium? Why would I be limited? Or working with new technologies, interactive technologies, that I've been involved with for a long time, installations, works. All of these things kind of feed each other. So I'm looking for, the ACM book that you talk about is basically about mobility of practice. In order to get mobility of practice or assert it, sometimes there's a lot of resistance to that. There's a channeling that is given to people. A lot of times it's gender-based or it's ethnicity or race-based or whatever it's based. But whatever it is, you have to find people who are not doing it, and that's going to be your community.
Yeah, I was interested in Paris. At UCAM, you asked the audience if they knew of compositions that used hip hop, and when I heard that question, I thought, why don't more people ask that question? Because here in this country, there's a term that people will say new music, and to me, I kind of prefer like contemporary classical or notated music or whatever it is between, something more specific, because new music could be some new hip hop, and the new hip hop might sound a bit more new than some new music some of the time. So I like the fact that you asked that question. And just thinking about this, moving through spheres, I asked through different spheres of media and genre. I asked my Facebook friends. I said, I'm interviewing George Lewis today. What questions would I ask? And I was interested to see people from all around the world in classical music, improvised music, asked me. Most of them said say hello because I met him.
Hi. Hi, Facebook.
Met him in the 80s.
Number one, because they know I'm not on Facebook, so if they want to talk to me, that's the only way to do it.
Exactly, well, that's great.
Can't do it that way.
Yeah, you can. You have to come to one of your concerts. And one person said, for people who've never heard his music, what piece would he recommend that they listen to first? That's a fan question.
That's an odd question. Does it matter?
I love that. I think that's the best answer ever.
One other answer is that people would say, "Oh, the one I did last week."
Yeah.
You know, people want you to hear their newest work.
Isn't Ellington say the next piece? Didn't he say my next piece?
I don't remember that.
I feel
but
like I've
it
read that
sounds
he
like
said
it
my
could be him. It could be him. Yeah. Then whatever the next piece is, check it out right away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait for it. You know.
Yeah.
You know, I couldn't answer that in any way. I mean, I do have my personal favorites, but I hate to play favorites.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the stuff that I thought I didn't like in the pieces, there was some I thought, oh, it's not working out so well. Someone comes along and says, I really like this, and here's my interpretation of it. I couldn't believe this.
Wow.
And it restored my faith. And then I realized that it wasn't up to me to play favorites about which pieces were the best anymore. Just put them out there and let people find their own way.
And I had a final question for you, which is, you know, thinking about different performers. You mentioned Ice and Claire Chase, and are you thinking about different performers in the composition of the piece? I know it can then obviously go to someone else, but when you're composing, are you thinking of the specific people like that might be playing the piece?
Sometimes.
In the case of Stephen Schick, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, but once you're thinking of, well, Stephen Schick, I think that's a very strongly typed situation because I still have a bit of work to do on this, you know. The Skirball, the performance as it was of Soundlines in Los Angeles and in Banff was only 25 minutes. But the piece is supposed to be 45 minutes. So between now and about maybe a few weeks from now, I have to write a lot of little knee plays or entr'actes, you know, solo pieces. And one of them is supposed to be a Steve Schick solo piece. So when you write a Steve Schick solo piece, you know, there's a lot of possibilities there, but you're almost tempted to take advantage of the great virtuosity of one of the super performers, you know. But at the same time, you just don't want it to be just a lot of stuff just to be doing things. You know? So I'm trying to figure out what to do there. Other pieces, I'm always thinking about the person, but I'm thinking about what happens afterwards as well. So the person becomes the impetus. For example, I have a piece for solo cello which Mariel Roberts had played many times, and she's just fantastic in this piece. And it was written very much for certain things that she could do that she showed me or that we talked about, and I have little videos of her doing it. And when Mariel does it, it's very special. But maybe when other people start doing it, maybe a lot of it will be they'll be walking in the footsteps of Mariel, but then they'll also be creating their own way. So maybe there's a kind of a great chain of noisy being about these things rather than a kind of a strict notion of, well, I'm writing it for this person that's going to be who they are. I mean, I think that was very much more prevalent maybe a longer time ago where you'd write something for a specific individual, but then it never lasts. You know, I mean, when Barrio writes for Kathy Barbarian, it starts there, and now everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
You know, and you can't say that they're doing it like Kathy. Or I wrote Anthem for Wet Ink and Kate Soper, and you know, whoever plays it, I hear Kate. But I really shouldn't.
Yeah.
But in a way, and I hear these one like Robin Stites, I think it was, this incredible performance of it, and she didn't sound like Kate at all. So even if you end up writing it for someone, I don't think that creative performance should be bound by that in any way. Maybe there's a sense in which there are many interpretations that work, and I just love hearing them.
And do you have anything else you want to add about either of these pieces, Soundlines or P Multitudinous?
I don't know. There's already a lot there. We talked about a lot of things.
Just if there's anything you felt like you wanted to add.
Well, I could go on forever.
Yeah, I know you could.
So thank you very much.
No, thank you.
These are great questions, and it's great
That's
to be talking to a fellow creative artist about these things.
Yeah, no, it's an honor to do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.